Their windows. I kept thinking about that hiss in the pipe, the sound that started it all. I didn't sleep. I just sat by the kitchen table, staring at my hands, the same ones that had closed that valve, the same ones that tried to stop it. The smell was still there, faint but persistent. It reminded me of the plant, of the river, of everything I couldn't undo. The next morning, the headlines were worse. Plant worker responsible for toxic spill. River contamination forces water ban. My phone buzzed nonstop. Reporters, investigators, co-workers pretending to care. I turned it off and walked outside. The air was sharp, freezing, but cleaner than the night before. Across the street, a kid was writing something on the sidewalk with chalk. A fish with a sad face and the words, "No more water." His mother called him inside when she saw me. I realized then that I wasn't just fired. I was erased. The days after the spill blurred together, as if time itself refused to move forward every morning. I woke up expecting to hear the hum of the plant again, the steady rhythm of machines that had once shaped my entire life. Instead, there was silence. The town that had always been half awake, trucks starting early, kids waiting for school buses, dogs barking near the bridge, had gone still. The water ban was announced within hours. Supermarkets emptied before noon. People filled bathtubs, buckets, anything that could hold water. The radio played the same warnings over and over, telling everyone to avoid the taps, not to shower, not to cook. Each time the announcement ended, they repeated the same phrase: due to a chemical spill caused by an employee at the local processing facility. That phrase became my name. My wife tried to hold things together at first. She still went to work for a few days, though her co-workers stopped talking when she entered the break room at night. She sat at the edge of the bed, staring at the wall, holding her phone like it was a shield. When she finally spoke, her voice was thin, fragile, as if the words had to squeeze through a wall inside her. She asked what really happened. I told her everything. About the leak, the failed equipment, the ignored reports, about staying behind after the others left. She listened without interrupting, but when I finished, she only said, "No one will believe that." She was right. The first investigator came 2 days later. A man in a black jacket with a clipboard and a badge that said, Environmental Response Division. He asked me to recount the entire shift minute by minute. I did. He wrote it down, nodded, asked again. But in a slightly different order, I realized then that the questions weren't about finding truth. They were about finding consistency, or the lack of it. When I mentioned the broken cameras, he looked up, as if he hadn't expected me to know about them. "That's not relevant at this time," he said. "They said I caused the spill that poisoned the river. By the time I tried to explain, the town had already decided who I was. The man who ruined their lives. I still remember the night sky turning the color of rust and the silence that followed when the siren stopped. They said I caused the spill that poisoned the river. By the time I tried to explain, the town had already decided who I was, the man who ruined their lives. I still remember the night sky turning the color of rust and the silence that followed when the siren stopped. The plant always smelled faintly of metal and ammonia, even before the accident. It clung to your clothes, your hair, your skin. I used to come home and wash twice before I could eat. My wife would keep the windows closed when I got back, saying the air around me was heavier. I thought it was just part of the job. Something you stop noticing once it becomes normal. That winter had been colder than usual. Pipes froze, lines cracked. The maintenance logs piled up faster than we could sign them. I worked 12-hour shifts for weeks, sometimes more. We were short-staffed, as always. Management said it was temporary, that budgets were being optimized. It was the same word they used when we stopped replacing parts that still looked good enough. The night of the spill started like any other. I clocked in a few minutes early, grabbed coffee from the same dented thermos, and walked the long hallway past the control room. I knew every flickering light, every uneven tile. The air hummed with static and the low vibration of pumps under the floor. To anyone else, it might have sounded like background noise. To me, it was rhythm. The heartbeat of the place around 2 a.m., I noticed a change in the readings. Pressure was rising in one of the containment lines. A slow build, just a few psi higher than normal. It wasn't alarming, not yet, but I marked it down and radioed the night supervisor. No response. I called again. Nothing. I checked the cameras. 2 of them were offline. That wasn't unusual either. They'd been down for weeks, waiting for budget approval. So I went down to inspect it myself. The containment corridor was colder than the rest of the plant. I could see my breath when I opened the door. The metal walls sweated condensation that ran in thin lines to the floor drains. I heard a faint hiss. Not sharp, but constant. Like a whisper, I followed it to one of the valve junctions and saw a trace of vapor curling from the seal. A slow leak. I tagged it immediately, logged the pressure, and shut down the line. It should have been enough. But the system was old, and the backup sensors were known to lag behind real conditions. So I stayed to monitor it manually. The next hour felt longer than any I'd ever lived. The hiss didn't stop. It grew. A tremor ran through the pipe, and I knew something was wrong deeper in the system. Maybe a failed relief valve. Maybe ice in one of the transfer lines. I radioed again. This time someone answered. A young operator from another section. He told me not to touch anything until morning, that engineering would handle it after shift change. I stayed anyway. By 3:17 a.m., the floor vibrated hard enough to rattle the gauges. A low thud echoed from the main tank bay, followed by a gust of warm air that smelled like solvent and rot. I hit the emergency cutoff, but it was too late. The alarm started screaming, red lights flashing in every corner. Steam burst from the joint near my head. The hiss turned into a roar. I ran. The air was thick, heavy, chemical, like breathing through plastic. I reached the outer platform and saw a white cloud spreading from the tank vents, rolling across the yard toward the river. It moved silently like fog, but it carried the sharp bite of ammonia and something darker beneath it. By dawn, the river was dead. Fish floated belly up near the banks, birds lay still on the ice. The city bridge shimmered in the distance, and the sunlight turned the plume into a dull bronze haze. I stood at the fence with my badge still clipped to my shirt, watching emergency trucks gather at the gate. When the news broke, my name was already on the front page. They said a technician had overridden safety protocols, causing a catastrophic release of chemicals into the Elk River. They used my employee ID as proof. No mention of the broken cameras. No mention of the ignored warnings or the maintenance reports that went unanswered for months. By noon, I was suspended. By sunset, I was fired. The company released a statement expressing deep regret and full cooperation with authorities. My name was in the second paragraph, right between the words negligence and operator error. That night, I went home and found police cars outside my house. They didn't arrest me, not yet, but they searched everything. My wife stood on the porch, shivering under a blanket, asking questions no one answered. The neighbors watched from.
I asked if the company would hand over maintenance records. He said those were under review. Then he thanked me for my cooperation and left. 2 hours later, I saw him on television standing next to the plant manager at a press conference. The manager was smiling faintly, saying how deeply the company regretted the actions of one individual whose negligence led to this tragedy. That was the moment something inside me cracked. Not loudly, not even painfully. Just a small shift, the kind that changes the shape of your thoughts. For the next few weeks, I stayed mostly indoors. The phone kept ringing. Reporters left notes under the door. Strangers parked outside my house, waiting for a glimpse of the man who had poisoned their river. Once I went out to buy groceries, but when I reached the store, a man shouted from across the aisle, "You killed the fish, you bastard!" I left without buying anything. Bills kept coming. The company stopped my benefits. My savings were barely enough to cover a month's rent. My wife moved in with her sister after a few days, but she didn't come back. She took her things quietly while I was out walking one night. I found a note on the table. Short, polite, final. I started collecting newspaper clippings. It became a habit, maybe a form of punishment. I stacked them on the kitchen counter one after another until the surface was covered in headlines about the spill. Thousands without water. Cleanup could take months. Local worker under investigation. Every article used the same photo of the river, the brown current bending under the bridge, glinting in weak winter light. I kept reading, searching for one line that might mention faulty equipment or missing safety checks. Nothing. The narrative had already been written. I was the careless worker, the cause, the face of the disaster. A few weeks later, federal inspectors arrived. They sealed off the plant, took samples, photographed everything. I wasn't allowed near the site, but I drove past it once, slowly, just to see. The chain-link fence was wrapped in yellow tape. Beyond it, the tanks stood like monuments, silent, corroded, indifferent. Someone had spray-painted words on the outer wall, "Burn it all down." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the line that ruptured, the sound it made before the alarms. I could still hear it if I closed my eyes. That thin, steady hiss, soft enough to be mistaken for wind. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It had become a memory that filled every quiet moment. I tried to write a letter to the authorities, explaining everything again. I attached maintenance records I'd saved, copies of inspection forms, some with my handwriting, some with signatures from supervisors. I mailed them all to the Environmental Division, but weeks passed and I heard nothing. One morning, a brown envelope arrived instead. Inside was a formal notice. You are hereby notified that you may be subject to criminal investigation pending further review. It wasn't a surprise. I'd been waiting for it, really. But reading those words made the silence in the house even deeper. I spent the next few days walking along the riverbank, where cleanup crews had set up tents and barriers. The water still smelled faintly of chemicals, sharp and metallic. A group of volunteers were collecting dead fish in buckets. One of them looked at me, hesitated, then turned away. I wanted to tell them I was sorry, though the word had started to lose meaning. Sorry didn't bring back the river. Sorry didn't change the way people crossed the street when they saw me. As winter turned to spring, the news cycle moved on. A train derailment somewhere else, a storm down south. The town began to recover slowly. Businesses reopened, the water ban lifted, but the silence around me remained. I began fixing things in the house. Loose door handles, leaky faucets, the squeak in the floorboards. I wasn't trying to stay busy. But buried among them were a few that caught my attention. Warnings about corrosion in the transfer pipes dated months before the spill. Each one had the same closing note, deferred to next maintenance cycle. I began to organize everything, building my own record of what had really happened. It wasn't about clearing my name anymore. It was about understanding the pattern, the small decisions, the postponed repairs, the signatures that made neglect official. A month later, the company released their own internal report. It was 27 pages long and full of phrases like unforeseen failure and unprecedented mechanical fault. They admitted no liability. The cause was listed as a human oversight. I stared at that phrase for a long time. Two words that carried the weight of a poisoned river. The investigation dragged into summer. I was summoned again, this time by a federal review board. They wanted to question me about a protocol deviation. When I asked what that meant, they said the automatic shutoff had been disabled earlier in the night, and the log showed my ID used for the override. It took me a moment to process that. The override code was only used in emergencies, and I hadn't entered it. I told them as much. They nodded, made notes, and asked again, "So you deny using your credentials to access the control system?" I told them I wasn't even near the control terminal when it happened. But they had timestamps and security entries that said otherwise. After the hearing, I drove to the plant perimeter again. Oh, the gate was still sealed, but I could see through the gaps in the fence, workers in protective suits, trucks hauling away debris. The main control building stood untouched. I thought about the terminals inside, the logs, the system that held every key, stroke, and command. If someone had used my credentials, it had to be from there. For the first time, I realized the scale of what I was up against. This wasn't just about negligence. Someone had deliberately shifted the blame. A few nights later, Jerry came by uninvited. He stood at the door holding a small folder wrapped in a plastic bag. "You didn't get this from me," he said. Inside were photocopies of old schematics and maintenance forms, ones that predated the ownership change. Handwritten notes in the margins pointed to weaknesses in the same section of piping that had failed. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked. He shrugged. "Because you're the only one who still cares." After he left, I sat at the table for hours, reading through every page. The documents weren't direct proof, but they painted a pattern: years of delayed inspections and falsified signatures. The kind of neglect that doesn't happen by accident. I realized I couldn't stay silent anymore. If I was already guilty in everyone's eyes, I might as well tell the truth. I didn't know who would listen, but I started writing everything down. The sequence of events, the reports, the people who ignored them. I turned my kitchen into a wall of papers and strings, connecting every detail that might explain what really caused that night. Each note, each connection was like a small act of resistance. The town might have erased me, but I still remembered the truth. And truth, no matter how buried, had a way of surfacing eventually. By the time summer settled in, my kitchen looked less like a home and more like an archive. Every surface was covered: tables, counters, even the floor near the window. I had sorted the papers into stacks labeled maintenance, reports, safety, and personnel. The organization gave me something that felt close to control. Each document carried its own kind of weight, as though the truth was scattered in fragments and I only needed to put them in the right order to see the whole shape of what happened. The problem was no one wanted to see it. I started contacting journalists. I printed it out and stored a copy in a sealed envelope, just in case. By late August, I noticed a car parked across the street more than once. It was an old blue sedan with tinted windows. It never stayed long, but I saw it enough times to know it wasn't random. When I stepped outside, it would drive off slowly, not fast enough to be suspicious, just slow enough to let me see it leave. One night, around midnight, I heard footsteps outside my porch. When I opened the door, no one was there, but the gate was unlatched. I checked the shed. The boxes were untouched, but the padlock had been moved slightly, as if someone had tested it. That was the first time I felt real fear. Not for what had happened, but for what might still happen. I called the local police again, but they told me there was nothing they could do without evidence. It could be just kids again, the officer said, the same one who had come before. After that, I started sleeping with the light on. The constant glow felt safer than the dark. Weeks passed. The noise faded again. No more cars. No more letters. Just the quiet hum of late summer nights, the kind of stillness that hides under heat. I tried to believe it was over. I started fixing the fence, repainting the porch, doing small things that made the house look less like a shell and more like a place to live again. And then one morning I went to the mailbox and found a plain envelope, no return address. Inside was a single printed page, a screenshot of an internal email from the plant's corporate server. It was dated the night before the spill. The subject line read, "Override authorization, approved by management." Below it were two names. One of them was mine. The other belonged to someone much higher up. A supervisor who had left the company a week after the disaster and moved out of state. There was no note, no explanation, nothing else. Just that image. I stood there for a long time, the paper trembling slightly in my hands. It wasn't proof of innocence yet, but it was the first real sign that I wasn't entirely wrong about what had happened. Someone else had used that override, and they had used my name to do it. I looked out toward the horizon where the plant used to glow faintly at night. The air was clear now, but the silence still felt the same, heavy, waiting. For the first time since that night, I felt something sharper than despair. It wasn't hope, not yet, but it was direction, and I knew I wasn't done. The first winter after the spill was the hardest. The air itself seemed to carry the memory of chemicals, even though the officials insisted the readings were safe. Snow would fall across the riverbanks, pure white on top, gray underneath when it melted. People still looked at me when I passed by, not as fiercely as before, but enough to remind me that forgiveness hadn't arrived yet. I spent those months repairing small engines and cleaning old boats that had been left to rot. It didn't pay much, but it gave me a rhythm, something predictable. The sound of a wrench against metal replaced the sound of accusations in my head. Sometimes I caught myself listening for the sirens that had once defined my nights, but they never came. Only the steady hum of cold wind over the river. I kept a notebook of the people who moved away after the spill. Families I used to wave to at the store, men who'd worked beside me at the plant. Some left because they lost faith in the water. Some left because they couldn't stand what remained of the town. Writing their names was my way of remembering that the tragedy wasn't only chemical, it was human. When spring returned, the color of the water began to shift. It wasn't clear, but it wasn't dead anymore. Green edges appeared near the banks, the stubborn kind of life that doesn't wait for permission. I started volunteering to test the river for contaminants, working quietly with an environmental group that didn't know my history at first. When they found out, I expected them to ask me to leave. They didn't. They only told me that if I wanted to help, I should keep showing up. So I did. Each week, I'd carry glass vials and record the readings, walking the same stretch of river where everything began. I learned how to read patterns in the data, small drops in toxicity, occasional spikes after rain. It was slow work, almost invisible, but it felt like redemption in fractions. One afternoon, I found a dead heron tangled in debris. Its feathers were gray, matted with oil. I buried it near the edge of the trees and marked the spot with a small stone. That night, I couldn't sleep. I thought about how something so graceful had been caught in what we left behind. It wasn't guilt that kept me awake anymore. It was the realization that I could never fix everything. But I could keep trying. People in town began to speak to me again. Short greetings, cautious but real. The man at the hardware store started asking if I needed supplies on credit. Even the mayor, who once called me reckless, nodded to me during a cleanup event. Oh, it wasn't absolution, but it was movement. The hardest part was visiting the site of the old plant. It stood half demolished, a skeleton of metal beams and collapsed walls. I walked through it one morning, stepping over shards of glass and melted plastic. The smell was faint but familiar. I placed my hand on a rusted tank, the same kind that had leaked that night, and stayed there until the cold bit into my palm. I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. I just stood there, and for the first time, it didn't feel like the place was holding me prisoner. Later that summer, a community group organized a memorial by the river. They read names, not of the dead but of those displaced. The families who had to leave, the ones who lost homes. Jobs, trust. I stood in the crowd, silent, listening. No one mentioned my name. I didn't expect them to. But when the ceremony ended, an older woman approached me. She had lost her garden that year, her soil poisoned beyond repair. She told me she had heard what I was doing with the cleanup teams. She didn't thank me. She only said, "It's good that someone stayed." Then she walked away. That night, I sat by the river, the sound of water soft and uneven. I realized that staying wasn't punishment anymore. It was a choice. The kind of choice you make when you understand that redemption doesn't arrive with applause or forgiveness. It arrives quietly in the steady work of repairing what was broken, even if no one notices. I began to rebuild the old dock near my house, plank by plank. I didn't know if anyone would ever use it again, but I wanted to give the river something back, something that could float even after everything that sank. By the second year, silence had become my companion. Not the kind that isolates, but the kind that teaches you to listen. To the rustle of reeds, to the hum of trucks on the highway, to the faint movement of life returning. I learned that rebuilding a town isn't about grand gestures. It's about the unnoticed repairs, a fixed fence, a clean trail, a neighbor who finally waves back. Every week, I met with the environmental group by the public library. We discussed progress reports, budgets, and the slow approval process for grants that always seemed to take longer than promised. Oh, I never spoke much. My name still carried weight, and I didn't want to draw attention to it, but I worked longer hours than anyone. It wasn't about forgiveness anymore. It was about contribution. Something measurable, something that... Heavy rain pounded the town for 2 days straight, swelling the river past its banks. I stood by the dock and watched the water rise, brown and angry. All I could think of was that night, the chemical leak, the panic, the alarms. But this time, there was no siren, no smell of metal. Fixing them became part of a quiet ritual. Each time I turned a screw or aligned a gear, I felt like I was undoing a fragment of what had gone wrong years ago. One afternoon, a young man walked in. He couldn't have been older than 20. He told me his father used to work at the plant before it closed. He said his father had spoken of me once, not with anger, but with regret for how quickly the town had chosen blame over truth. He didn't ask for anything. He just wanted to shake my hand. That simple gesture left me standing there long after he'd gone. unsure what to do with the feeling it left behind. Around that time, the environmental group started talking about long-term restoration, new filtration systems, replanting native vegetation, monitoring groundwater. They asked if I'd help oversee a section of the project. It wasn't paid work, but I agreed. I wanted to make sure the recovery didn't fade into complacency once the headlines disappeared. The work was steady, repetitive. We took soil samples, recorded numbers, checked the color of runoff after rain. Sometimes the data felt meaningless, decimals and gradients that didn't capture the human weight behind them. But then I'd see small signs. Frogs returning to the shallows, reeds growing tall again, a patch of wildflowers near the embankment. The world doesn't rebuild at once. It chooses its moments. One morning, while working near the northern bank, I saw children throwing stones into the water. Their laughter echoed through the air. A few years ago, no one would have let them near the river. Now, parents watched from the grass, cautious but trusting. That was when I realized that healing isn't a single event. It's a series of quiet permissions to return, to try, to believe. By late summer, the cleanup team decided to take down the last of the warning signs. I was there when they did it. The yellow boards had been standing for years, faded and cracked. When we removed them, the posts left pale marks in the soil like scars that would soon blend into the earth. I kept one of the signs, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of what it cost to reach that moment. I still lived alone. The house was small, but I had rebuilt it slowly over the years, plank by plank. I grew herbs near the porch and repaired the fence I'd once ignored. My life had narrowed, but it was steady. I no longer measured my days by what I'd lost, but by what remained functional, what could still be tended to. Sometimes at night, I'd hear the faint echo of sirens from another part of town. Not real ones, just the kind memory creates. I'd close my eyes and breathe until the sound faded. The mind remembers trauma like it's a habit, but over time, even habits weaken. One evening in September, I received a letter from a local journalist. She wanted to interview me for an article about the town's recovery. She wrote that she knew who I was and that she believed people deserved to hear from me again. I didn't respond at first. The idea of speaking publicly after years of silence felt dangerous. Not because I feared what others would say, but because I wasn't sure I had the right to speak. Weeks later, I finally wrote back. I told her I'd talk, but only if she didn't make it about blame. I wanted the story to be about persistence, about how places can come back even after being written off. She agreed. The interview took place by the river near the rebuilt dock. She asked gentle questions, recorded my answers with quiet patience. When the article was published, I expected backlash, but it never came. The comments were cautious, even kind. People shared memories of the town before the spill, stories of what they'd lost and rebuilt. My name was no longer a target, just part of the history. I kept the newspaper folded on my table. It wasn't redemption, it was acknowledgement. As the year ended, I found myself walking the river path more often. I stopped counting the years since the disaster. Time had softened the edges of everything. The water moved freely again. Birds nested in the trees. The town had scars, yes, but it also had roots. Deep, stubborn, alive. And for the first time in a long while, I realized I wasn't waiting for forgiveness anymore. I was simply living. The winter that followed was quiet. Snow layered the rooftops and softened the shape of everything. I spent most of my days in the workshop fixing whatever people brought in: frozen pipes, broken pumps, a rusted water heater from a house that had stood empty since the spill. I liked the steadiness of it, the sense that even damaged things could find new purpose if handled carefully enough. The article from the local paper had changed something subtle in town. People nodded to me more often. Sometimes they stopped to ask how the river was doing. There were still those who avoided my eyes, but even that felt different now. Less like hatred, more like distance. That time was slowly dissolving. I didn't try to win anyone over. I just kept working. One afternoon in February, a storm rolled through. The snow turned to freezing rain, and power lines snapped under the weight of ice. Most of the town went dark. I stayed in my house, listening to the hum of the generator I'd repaired months earlier. When it finally sputtered out, I lit a candle and sat by the window. Outside, the river reflected the faint orange of the streetlights, bending with the wind. For a moment, I thought about the first night of the disaster, how the sky had burned, how the town had turned against itself. Now the same darkness felt different. It was calm. There was no panic, no sirens, no blame. Just the world doing what it always did, breaking and mending in its own rhythm. The next morning, I walked to the main road. Fallen branches littered the ground, but the town was already awake. Neighbors helped clear driveways, shared generators, offered food. It reminded me of something I had almost forgotten, how people returned to each other after enough silence. In the following weeks, the cleanup project reached its final phase. We installed new sensors near the treatment plant, updated the filtration systems, and removed the last of the contaminated soil. The team planned to hold a small ceremony to mark the completion. They wanted me to speak, but I declined. I told them it was better if the river spoke for itself now. I still went though. I stood at the edge of the crowd, unnoticed. Children ran by, chasing each other along the newly restored banks. The air was clean, cold, alive. When they released paper lanterns into the sky, their reflections glowed across the water. It looked almost like the night of the spill, but this time the light didn't come from fire. It came from people choosing to stay. After the ceremony, I walked home slowly. The snow had begun to melt, revealing the dark soil underneath. I thought about how time layers itself, disaster, grief, healing, until one day all you see is the surface, but you know what lies beneath. In March, I received a letter from the Environmental Department again. They were closing the case officially. The water was clean. The soil was safe. The town's recovery was considered complete. There was no mention of the night that had started it all, no names, no blame, just numbers and confirmation. I read it twice and placed it beside the old letter I'd kept years ago. 2 different chapters of the same story. Days turned longer. The sun returned. My hands stayed busy with work that mattered in small ways. Fixing, maintaining, preparing. Sometimes I'd stop and listen to the river, trying to hear if it still carried any echo of what we had done to it. But all I heard was the sound of moving water, steady and constant. One evening, while walking home from the workshop, I passed the schoolyard. Children were playing near the fence, their laughter carried by the wind. I realized many of them weren't even born when the spill happened. To them, it was only a story adults whispered about, something that had happened long ago in another time. That realization brought me a kind of peace I hadn't expected. The event that had once defined my entire life was slowly becoming history, fading into the quiet archive of memory where all pain eventually goes. At home, I sat by the window, looking out over the river as dusk settled. The water moved without urgency, reflecting the faint colors of sunset. I thought about how far I'd come. Not forward exactly, but deeper. Into understanding, into patience. I knew then that my life wouldn't ever be what it was before, but maybe that was never the point. Maybe it was about learning how to live in what remained, to care for it, to protect it, to make it enough. The candle on my table flickered. Outside, the river kept moving. And for the first time in years, I felt no need to measure the distance between what had been lost and what had been restored. It was all part of the same current carrying everything: guilt, forgiveness, and the quiet persistence of survival downstream. Spring arrived slowly that year, as if unsure whether the town was ready for renewal. The trees budded later than usual, and the air still carried the cool weight of winter. But beneath it all, there was a sense of return, soft, cautious, and real. I spent my mornings walking along the same path by the river, the one that had once been closed off by warning tape and fences. The ground was uneven where the soil had been dug up and replaced, but grass was starting to grow again. I picked up litter when I saw it, small pieces of plastic or glass carried by the current. It had become habit, the kind of task that didn't change the world, but changed how I moved through it. The dock I'd rebuilt had weathered its first full year. The boards were graying, the nails slightly rusted, but it held firm against the current. Sometimes I'd see people standing there, fishing, talking, or just watching the water. They didn't know I'd built it, and I never told them. It was enough to see it being used. That spring, the local government announced plans for a memorial garden near the river. It wasn't meant to reopen old wounds, they said, but to mark how far the community had come. They asked for volunteers to help with the design and planting. I signed up quietly, listed only as a local resident. We spent weeks clearing the area, laying new soil, planting trees and flowers that could thrive near the water. I worked beside people who had once crossed the street to avoid me. No one mentioned the past. The only words exchanged were about weather, soil, and where to place the benches. It felt like forgiveness without formality, the kind that doesn't need to be spoken to exist. One morning, while planting saplings, I found a small metal tag buried in the dirt. It was stamped with a number and part of the company's old logo. I turned it over in my hand for a long time, feeling the weight of it. Then I placed it at the base of a new tree and covered it with soil. Some things I realized belong to the earth now, too heavy to carry any longer. When the garden was finished, it didn't look like much, just a few paths, benches, and trees, but over time it began to draw people, walkers, children, older couples. The air there felt different, calmer. The kind of peace that comes after years of waiting for something to end and finally realizing it already has. By summer, my repair shop had become part of the town's quiet rhythm. I wasn't busy every day, but there was always something to fix. I liked the sound of tools, the small click of progress. Some nights I'd leave the door open to hear the river as I worked. The water carried a steady rhythm that filled the spaces silence used to occupy. I kept the old yellow warning sign hanging on the back wall of the shop. People asked why I hadn't thrown it away. I never gave them an answer, maybe because I didn't want to forget. Not out of guilt, but because forgetting would erase what we learned. How fragile everything is, how easily trust can break, and how quietly it can be rebuilt. Late that summer, the journalist who had interviewed me sent another message. She said she was writing a follow-up piece 5 years after the cleanup. She wanted to know what had changed for me personally. I thought about ignoring it, but eventually I wrote back. I told her I didn't have much to say, only that I'd learned something simple. The opposite of destruction isn't creation, it's care. When the second article was published, I didn't even buy a copy. I didn't need to see my name in print again. I was content knowing the story had moved beyond me, that it now belonged to everyone who stayed, worked, and waited for the river to breathe again. One evening, I stood on the dock, watching the reflection of the sunset stretch across the water. The air smelled clean, just faintly metallic, like rain before it falls. I thought about all the nights I had spent fearing this river, and how now it had become the only place I felt at peace. I closed my eyes and listened to the low hum of crickets, the gentle lap of water against wood, the quiet pulse of a place that had survived itself. The sound wasn't forgiveness, it was continuity. Life moving forward, unbothered by who was to blame, focused only on the next tide. The world had gone on, and finally so had I. Autumn came back the same way it always had, soft and unspectacular. The trees turned their edges first, amber, then brown, and the air grew thinner each morning. By then, 5 full years had passed since the night of the spill. The town had learned to stop measuring time by that event. It had folded into the past like a scar beneath new skin. Still there, still visible in certain light, but no longer open. The memorial garden had grown into itself. The trees we'd planted had taken root, their branches thickening, their leaves casting real shade. I'd visit sometimes after closing the shop, sitting on one of the benches with no particular reason. The place had a quiet hum to it, like the sound of a machine running smoothly after years of careful repair. There was a plaque near the entrance, listing no names, no company logos, just a line engraved into the metal. For the ones who stayed, it was simple, but it felt right. That fall, I started writing down pieces of my story. Not for publication, not even for others to read, just for myself. I wanted to understand the sequence of everything, the small choices that had turned into consequences, the moments that shaped how I learned to live again. I wrote in short, steady sentences without judgment or explanation. It wasn't about proving innocence anymore. It was about recognizing endurance. Sometimes as I wrote, I'd pause to listen to the world outside. A passing truck, wind brushing against the windows, the faint movement of water in the distance. I'd think about how all of it had once felt unbearable, and now it was simply ordinary. That, I realized, was what recovery really looked like. Not triumph, just normalcy returned. In late October, the environmental team officially disbanded. Their work was done. The town's water readings had stayed clear for more than 2 years, and the last contaminated soil site had been replaced with native grass. They sent a short note of thanks, unsigned, just stamped with the department seal. I pinned it beside the old letters on my wall. Together, they told the story better than I ever could. The rise, the ruin, the quiet repair. On the last evening before winter, I walked to the river. The air carried the first bite of cold, and the water reflected a muted gray sky. The dock stretched out in front of me, creaking softly as I stepped onto it. I stood there for a long while, breathing in the scent of damp wood and distant leaves. Across the water, the town lights shimmered faintly. Small, steady, unremarkable. There was no sign of what had once happened here. The earth had swallowed the evidence, leaving only memory behind. I didn't need to be forgiven anymore because I had finally learned what forgiveness actually was, not an act from others, but the quiet decision to stop punishing yourself. I stayed until darkness settled fully, then turned to leave. The river moved behind me, patient as always, carrying everything onward. The past, the pain, and the slow persistence of those who refused to give up. When I reached home, I turned off the light and listened to the silence. It wasn't empty anymore. It was full of everything that had survived. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to check out our other stories about real people and real emotions.